everyone, welcome to the February craft episode of Writes for Women. I hope you've been enjoying all the episodes so far. We've had Desney King on the Heart of Writing episode, the very first episode for 2021. We've had Penelope Janu talking about starting from scratch and answering 4 curly questions. And today we have, who do we have? We have Joanna Nell and talking to me on the Convo Couch today about revision and our respective processes. So it's going to be a really interesting chat where we just sort of shoot the breeze about how we both revise our writing. But before we started, I just wanted to do a massive shout out to those people who are supporting the podcast on Patreon. If you're not aware, Patreon is a subscriber option for the podcast. The podcast goes out every week for free on all the major platforms and on the website. But if you want to get something a little extra with the podcast, if you want to just show your support, there's a range of options you can take, and that just pays for my time in planning, preparing, researching, recording, editing, and releasing the podcast. So I'm really trying to make the podcast this year really helpful for women writers and just a resource that you can come to when you want a little bit of extra inspiration or some writing wisdom, writing tips on the business, craft and heart of writing, as well as finding out about some new authors who are coming on and who have new releases. So if you do want to support, you can support from anywhere from $2 to $5. It's as easy as going to the website and just clicking on the support us on Patreon link. And if you are a $3 or a $5 supporter, you'll get a monthly curated wisdom from the Convo Couch sheet, which will be like a selection of about 4 different pieces of advice or wisdom from each author over the course of that month. So that'll come out at the end of each month for those Patreon supporters. And in addition, if you're a community supporter, which is the $5 a month supporter, you'll get an extended edition of a selected episode each month, depending on who I think will be great to answer the 4 curly questions. And they'll be answered in both audio and video, and you'll get that in your inbox each month as well. And then I'm also going to do an Ask Pam Anything on the 5th Friday of the months that have 5 Fridays, and I will, anybody who's a Patreon supporter can throw some questions at me about anything to do with writing, publishing, anything at all really, that you would like. So thanks to the people who are currently supporting on Patreon, and I just want to give a shout out to those individuals. And in no particular order, thank you to Desney King, Sophie Masson, Vicky Holstein, Lynette Lounsbury, Cheryl Rosario, Chrissy Mios, and Rachel Johns. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate your support, and I hope that you're enjoying the podcast. I hope that you like the changes in the new format, and please let me know, everybody who's listening, if there's any suggestions you have for improving the podcast in any way at all, or things that you'd like to see happen, and people perhaps who you'd like to be on the podcast. I just want to now launch straight into introducing today's guest. Joanna Nell is a Sydney-based writer and GP, and she's an advocate for positive aging, which anybody who has read Jo's books would be very familiar with. The characters in her books are all older characters, and Jo is a really great proponent for aging gracefully and with respect, and treating elderly people in general as human beings and not necessarily just numbers in a system. So I really love that about Jo and about her writing. Her best-selling debut novel, The Single Ladies of Jacaranda Retirement Village, was published in 2018. The rights sold internationally, and I know that that has sold over 50,000 copies. So that's a great coup for Jo, who way back a few years ago, when I first met Jo, she'd just received the Valerie Parv Award at the RWA, and her career has just skyrocketed from there. Her second novel was The Last Voyage of Mrs. Henry Parker, was published in 2019, and her latest novel is The Great Escape from Woodlands Nursing Home, and it's currently flying off the shelves. Jo also writes award-winning fiction, which has been published in a number of magazines, journals and short story anthologies, including award-winning Australian writing. She's also written for the Sydney Morning Herald, Spectrum and Sunday Life magazines. I will say that Jo and I are members of the same writing group, the Inkwell, which is what's prompted me to bring her into this chat today on the revision process, because I know that we've both fairly recently finished revising novels. So it's going to be a great chat to her today, and we're going to talk about our respective processes and how we both go about that task of revision, which some people love and some people hate. And we're going to find out where Jo sits on that spectrum today. So, Jo, welcome back to the Convo Couch.
Thank you, Pam. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, well, I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to chat. I know that you have recently finished revising something.
You ever finish revising, but I'm sure we'll get to that.
True. And I've sort of recently, in the last months of last year, finished revising something. So I thought that that would be a good opportunity for us just to have a general chat about revision and how we each approach that. But first of all, could you tell us about your latest release, which is sitting on the shelf up there behind you, The Great Escape from Woodlands Nursing Home?
Yeah, sure. So this is my third novel with Hachette, and it's continuing with my obsession or my interest or my passion for writing stories about evolving older characters. And for this book, The Great Escape from Woodlands Nursing Home, we actually go inside a nursing home, and the story is told from the point of view of two equally reluctant residents, or inmates as they call themselves. Hattie Bloom, who's a retired ornithologist and prefers birds to people, who ends up in the nursing home after a fall, after she's trying to save a nest of endangered owls in her tree. And she's in a hurry to get home to her owls and her birds. And in the room next door, Walter Clements, who is a gregarious dad joke or would-be comedian, who is also in a hurry to get home, but the indignity for him as a retired driving instructor is that he must first pass a driving test for his electric mobility scooter. And at first, the two appear to have very little in common until they meet at a clandestine social club run by the home's night nurse, the maverick night nurse, Sister Bronwyn. And very slowly a friendship forms. And when Sister Bronwyn is dismissed over her rather unconventional approach to aged care, Hattie and Walter must put aside their differences and hatch a plan with a couple of fellow inmates to have Sister Bronwyn reinstated. So that's basically it. We are inside the nursing home, and hopefully this is, although it doesn't shy away from many of the challenges of aged care, I wanted to be very realistic about that. Hopefully it's an uplifting, optimistic, and ultimately hopeful story about old age. Okay.
It's such a beautiful story, Jo, having read it some time ago now, and I think it's doing pretty well. Are you happy with how everything's going and the sort of feedback you're getting for the book?
Oh, yes, I am actually. Yeah, look, there were initial reviews and things which were, really wonderful, but I've had some fantastic feedback actually from people who work in nursing homes. In fact, a couple of real live Woodlands nursing homes that I didn't realize existed, one in New Zealand and one I think one in South Africa as
so
well.
They're called Woodlands?
Yes, that's right, I didn't realize. But no, the most sort of heartwarming thing for me has actually been receiving messages from people who've either had relatives or have worked themselves in the aged care industry, sort of telling me what the story had meant to them and how they'd related to it. So no, I've been really happy with the feedback I've got.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, well, I can vouch. If anyone out there hasn't read it, I can vouch for it. It's a fantastic read, and it's one where you actually find yourself laughing out loud 1 minute and then grabbing the tissues the next minute. So it's my favourite kind of book. But Jo, of course, since then, you have actually, since that's been released, you've finished the draft and a revised version of another book, which will be coming out later this year. That's correct, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. So we work a year behind. So the book that I've been writing in 2020, which, let's face it, hasn't been an ordinary year for writers, has been, so I've got to the stage where I submitted that to my publisher. I was a little bit behind on my deadline, actually, because so many things happened last year. I was working through that, and there were some sort of family things as well with my children. My daughter was going through HSC, numerous things were going on. And so I sort of missed my initial deadline for submission in October, which is something I've never done before. But my publisher was just amazing about that. And so I finally submitted that manuscript about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I'm waiting for what will probably be the first of several structural edits or further edits. So I would say there's a year almost of writing, and then at least 6 months to a year of editing, which I'm sure we'll go into. So a book a year actually doesn't mean a year. It means, there are actually 2 years to produce a book. So I'm in that lovely hiatus at the moment where I have nothing on my desk and just waiting for that next round of edits to come through.
Yeah.
And you're and you're obviously, you've had the experience of editing. I've just finished your book, All We Dream. It was just gorgeous. I just loved that book, and I'm sure you're going to talk about your experience of revisions on that too.
Oh, thanks, Joe. And everyone out there, this is purely coincidental that Joe has just finished that book when we are actually talking today about revision. But yeah, I guess the first thing that we probably should do if we're going to talk about revision is just give an overall view of, how you go about writing in general. Like, what's your overall process, Joe? I guess plotter or pantser, and then, just a little bit about how you generally approach your writing and revision.
Yes. So I think that the process, I'm still developing the process. I've completed 5 novels now, one of which is not or never will be published, 3 that are published, and 1 that is in the process. And I think that, yes, the actual process, I think you start to find something that works for you. You take the experience of what has worked with previous novels and what didn't work so well, and you hopefully apply that to the new work. So over the years, I suppose I've now fallen into the pattern, really, that the initial stage is when I discuss with my agent and my publisher about a proposal. And I often give them 2 or 3 ideas. I'll give them a little mini proposal or mini sketch or synopsis, because I think there are many ideas. I think, writers are having ideas. They're coming from all over, aren't they? But a lot of them won't actually be enough to make a novel, or perhaps won't sort of fit with what the publisher is looking for. So I try and give a few options. And when we've agreed which of those ideas we're going to go ahead with, it needs a little while to settle with me. I need to it's like percolating the coffee. I need to think about it for a little while, let the ideas come, and that could be a couple of months while I'm thinking about that and starting to hear the characters' voices and getting a bit of an outline. Then I suppose in a way I am a planner in that I like to have an outline, but I would say it's a loose outline. I'll do an initial sketch of where I know each of the plot points is, what the basic arc of that 3-act structure will be, and I'll actually print that out on a piece of A4 paper, and I'll actually put in the major points, and then I'll actually hone that by using these are quite old now, actually. These are my scene cards, and there are 13 of these scene cards. Initially, I got the idea from Ebony McKenna, who uses scene cards to write a novel, but I think also using these same plot points or turning points or prompts, if you like, I think been used by a lot of different books on craft. I think, say, The Cat Writes a Novel, they use something. So you could call them beats, if you like. So I'll often look at these. There'll be the opening image, and then in the corner I'll have the word count. So in a 90,000 word novel, I'll know around the 9,000 mark. We'll move from the opening image, which is the normal world, to whatever the disturbance is, the inciting image, and so on. And I start in Scrivener. I know you're a big Scrivener fan,
Yes.
Pam, and you probably know your way around it far better than I do. But I actually divide my Scrivener novel up into sections according to each of these. And then I write each of the chapters, which is basically usually 1 scene, sometimes 2 scenes. And I'll use that for my first draft. So I know that roughly I'm getting the right number of scenes. I can see visually where it needs a few more scenes, where there are too many. So I've roughly got that spaced out. And that will be, once I've finished the first draft, I move that into a Word document. Once I played around with perhaps moving the scenes around, I move that into a Word document and I print that out. And this is what it looks like. I go down to Officeworks and I print it. I don't bind it because I like to put it in the recycling afterwards, and I don't like to have to remove the binding from it. And then, yes, I will read through then as a reader, I think, just pretending I know nothing about it. And then, we move on to subsequent drafts there. And from then on, I'm working on a Word document. So that first draft will probably take me about 3 or 4 months. It's got a bit quicker, I think, as I sort of have a little bit more of a map in my mind about, where the story's going, or where the different beats are. But that usually takes about 3 or 4 months, and then really the hard work begins after that.
Yeah. Do you have much of a gap, Jo, between that first draft and when you start the sort of revision process?
I try to. I think that it's best if you can have that distance from it, and the longer the better. Really, it's very tempting as soon as you finish and you print the end to go back to the beginning, because for me, I think it's all about momentum in that first draft, and I'm sort of clocking up all these sort of mental notes all the way through, thinking, I'm going to change that. That's not going to stay the same. That name's going to change. But I have to get through on that momentum. And when I finish that first draft, if I can leave it for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, that's good. I think ideally you'd leave it for several months, but I think none of us who particularly have a contract have that luxury. But even leaving it for a week or 10 days before coming back to it is good. And I mean, obviously with your book, I think you'll talk about All We Dream, you actually had an interval of several years, really, from the very first version of that book to the revised version. So I'd be interested to hear how you felt that benefited you, Pam.
Well,
did it?
Well, no, it really did. And with that very first experience, I guess, of publishing that, which was in 2013, it was probably, of all my novels, the novel that I had rushed the most, because I had a really tight deadline. So my first novel, Blackwater Lake, came out in December 2012, and then I was basking in the glow of my debut novel being out, and I think in February my publisher Vanessa said to me, "Oh, so what else have you got?" And I just went, because I'm not someone who just sort of stockpiled writing. I had a literary style novel, like that one you talked about, It's Never Going to See the Light of Day, because it wasn't my natural voice, but I learned a lot from it. But yeah, I had a few fragments. I had a fragment about a younger woman, and I had a fragment about an older woman. And I thought, what if I put them together and just see what happens? And then, anyway, the story did come together miraculously. It's amazing when you put yourself under pressure what you can come up with. And I did write that draft in a few months, but I think, so that was February. I think I probably started writing in the March. I had to have the finished, or, as clean a version as I could get to the publisher by the end of June. And it was published in the December. So there was that revision time I had with the publisher in between, which was only, a month or two, really. But it was always a book that I loved the storyline. I loved the characters. I never read my books once they're in print, because I just can't
me
stand
neither.
the thought of, after you've revised them over and over, the thought of looking at them again in print is just like, oh no, not going to happen. So I knew in my head, I guess, that it was out there, and it did okay at the time. I think, I've had some lovely feedback on the original, and people did really enjoy the characters. And I found that the voice of the older character in particular really flowed well for me. And even that character when she was young, it's sort of got a historical thread. And the younger character of Esther, who was Essie when she was younger, her diaries that I wrote just seemed to roll, when you magically get on a roll and they come out almost, as they appear in the book type thing. But I always had in my head that I'd rushed the ending, and I would have liked to have devoted more time to the younger character and to her situation in the story. And so when I did get the opportunity to get my rights back for a book, that was the one that I luckily received. And so after it had been published 7 years later, I had the opportunity to revise it again. So,
Mm.
as you say, that was a really interesting process. It was quite confronting because I was reading writing that I'd written, 7 years ago and had been out in the world already. And, there was a lot of cringing going on for me.
Sometimes there are definitely things which are cringeworthy when you go back, but there's sometimes bits of absolute gold, and you think,
Yeah.
actually, this really worked. And I don't even remember writing this, and it's almost a sign that you're in that flow, in that sort of subconscious, that beautiful transcendental state where it just does flow. And then, of course, there'll be another bit which is
Yeah.
cringeworthy. But no, I
Yeah.
hope that you did find some bits that you were still in love with after that time.
Yeah, I did. And look, the essence, as I said, of the story was still there, and I loved that.
Mm,
And as mentioned, the older character, I really think there was, when I revised it this time around, the older character of Essie, the scenes with her in particular, I hardly
mm,
hardly touched. My instinct was right
mm,
there. They
mm.
had come
Yeah,
out pretty well.
yeah.
So it was really just a matter of sort of adding scenes to
Hmm.
make the story, more complete, I guess, towards the end,
Hmm.
and things I did around the other character, which we can talk about as we go on.
Yeah.
But Joe, we've talked about that whole idea of revising at the end of the draft. Do you do any revision as you're going? I know Pen Janu, who is one of our colleagues in Inkwell. Pen's a great one for really writing the scene in the morning and revising that same scene at night and then moving on type thing. Do you do that sort of thing, or do you just write all the way through?
Look, I wish I could, and I'm very envious of writers like Penny who can do that. And I think that's probably her lawyer background. She's very meticulous, and she'll probably produce something that's very close to a final draft. I can't do that. I think I just have to, I even call it my V draft, my sort of vomit draft almost. I let it go. I just have to let the sort of free, I have to let the ideas and the thought process flow. But I'm making mental notes as I go along. Sometimes I'll actually write those down, like, oh, okay, you need to research this here. Oh, this is not going to work, going to go back. But I find that if I go back, I get stuck on the words. I get stuck on making the sentence right, and changing that paragraph, whatever. In fact, what can happen is that you can get to the end and that whole scene will go, and the paragraph or the sentence I've spent hours making so beautiful or perfect is probably just not right for the story once I've got to the end. And I just let it go. And I like that freedom. I like that sort of to keep that momentum. And it's often not till I get to the end of the first draft that I even know what the story's about, what are the themes in this. And so I heard Neil Gaiman talk about this, and he said the first draft, it's you don't know what the story is about until you get to the end of that. The second draft is making that novel look as though you knew what it was about all the time. And I think once you get to the end, for me, I can keep that in my head and I can make all those changes as I go through the second draft. So really, I wouldn't show my first draft to anybody at all. I think by the end of a second draft, which there may be some bits from the first draft that I keep, a lot of it is thrown out, or I would rather say put in a separate folder, because I think it's a shame to ever throw that away. Or you can sort of con yourself and think, well, I'll just put it here. I'll put it in a separate folder for now and I'll use it somewhere else. And often it doesn't get used. And that's one way of sort of letting yourself down gently, if you like. But it has to make sense to the whole story. And I don't know that until I get to the end of the first draft. So the answer is no, I don't. I just keep going. And often have people changing names halfway through, the setting, the timeline is all over the place. And in fact, one thing I've done recently is learn timelines are my bête noire. They are my thing that I get wrong, and the editors drives them insane. Well, this was Tuesday afternoon. Now we're on Saturday morning, and where did this go? I actually, at the beginning of each chapter, now actually write the timeline at the beginning. This is Monday morning, or this is Tuesday afternoon, or this is the following week, or whatever. And I found that that's quite good. That's just a tip that I've learned between books. So yeah. What about you? Do you do any sort of
Look, I
editing
probably
or
tweak a little bit here and there, but like you, I mean, I think the best thing is to go all the way through as fast as you can. As you say, I love the
mm,
idea of having those plot points, and I have become more of a plotter. You know, I'm a pantser at heart, but
mm,
I've become more of a plotter over the years, I guess, because when you are published traditionally, as you are and as I have been, you
mm,
have to give a synopsis usually or some sort of idea
mm,
to the publisher. So you do have to have some sort of idea of the story in your head before you start. It's not a matter of just, you know, like with my first book, Blackwater Lake, I just had an image in my head and sat down
mm,
and as you say, vomited it onto the page, and somehow miraculously a story came about. But you know, I think I have become a little bit more of a plotter. But I think if you can push through that first draft as quickly
mm,
as you can, stay in
mm,
the flow of the writing,
mm,
and you know, I totally agree. You don't know the story until you get to the end, and there's going to be things that you then go back and change. You know, major things that you go back and change, and the story can end up being quite different to what you first envisaged, you know, or the emphasis of the story or
mhm,
whatever. I
mhm,
read a nice quote in a book I've got somewhere here, that revision is revisioning your story, you know,
mm,
seeing
mm,
it in a new
mm,
light.
mhm.
That's the first thing you should be doing when you revise. And I really like that idea.
Yeah, I don't think I can, with, you know, that comes down to this sort of, are you a plotter or a pantser? And I think people have a little bit of both
Yeah.
often, really. And I think I have to know roughly where I'm going. It's like setting the sat nav on the car when you're going on a journey. You know roughly where you're going and where you want to end up. Although I must admit, the ending is the bit that I change the most. I often have several different endings before
Yes,
I'm
you
happy with
do.
one.
Yeah.
But you know roughly the direction you're going, you know roughly how long it's going to take. But there may be things that look more interesting over here, or there's roadworks, or a dead end there, or
Yeah.
something happens. So I think that having that flexibility there is. I do admire people who can, and I know there are writers like James Patterson who produce really detailed, several tens of thousands of words of an outline before they start writing. And I haven't quite got to that point yet. That's something I
Yeah.
would aspire to do, but I have a rough outline. But I think giving yourself the freedom to change your mind if it's not working, and to explore other things is, that's where the creativity comes, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So, what's your first step, Joe, when you do give it that break for a couple of weeks or a month, if you have that luxury and you come back and you think, right, it's time for revision? What's the first thing you would do then? You know, after having read through it and made a few notes and a
Yeah,
few mental notes.
yeah. So, so once I've got they love me down at Office Works. I turn up with my USB, and each time they get me to sign a form saying this is my own work and I'm not stealing it. So I will read through that, not making any marks at all on that. So I will read through purely as a reader, so try and clear my head of any previous ideas of what I had, and to see where the pace is, how it flows, whether the characters are distinct enough, and just whether there's any enjoyment in it. Where I think as a writer, what you learn is what's good writing, or what's bad writing, what's working, and also what's not working instinctively when you get there. And so I'll read through again a second time, and this time I will make notes. It'll often mean crossing out whole sections. When I fall into, there are certain traps that I tend to find myself, or sort of diversions that I end up taking, and that is sometimes I'm over explaining things or getting on my high horse about issues or things, and and if it starts to veer off in exposition, as I'm on my soapbox about, pen goes through that. Sometimes it's obvious where I'm trying to milk something for the humor of it, or and I need to let the story flow rather than sort of trying to focus too much on that. Again, that's got to go. There'll be scenes which seem to have energy, and you'll feel that as you're reading them, and then there'll be scenes that feel really sluggish, and so it's a sense of where the pace is and where you need to pick up the pace. So at the end of that second draft, it's really about getting the overall structure for me, the overall arc of that. Are the scenes in the right order? Are we getting a build-up of tension as we go through? You know, are the beats coming at the right point towards that climax? And say the ending can sometimes change several times, but are we building up to that in the right way? And so it's rather like looking through a microscope. You know, start off with looking through a magnifying glass at it, but then you start to get down to the microscope and increase magnification. So it's big picture stuff. And this is the stage where you decide whether, you know, is the tense right? Is the point of view right? Are the characters, is the right character telling the story? Is have you got the right narrator? Have you got the right voice, the right setting? You know, there are all these questions which I think, you know, it's okay to let go in the first draft, but by the end of the second draft, I really want to have those things sort of pinned down. So.
And have you ever had the situation yet where there's been a major element, you know, you've read through that draft and made your notes, and there's been a major element where you've just gone, no, this is not working, I've got to make a big change there?
Well, absolutely, yes. On my second book, The Last Voyage of Mrs. Henry Parker, I actually got to the end of a second draft. So I had an 80,000 word manuscript, and I just knew it wasn't working. I just knew the whole thing really wasn't working very well, because I felt as though the wrong character was telling the story. And this is really where I threw out the whole lot, and I told it from the point of view of a single character who was Mrs. Henry Parker. And that was like a light bulb moment for me. And I haven't done that before. I can usually, I mean, that's heartbreaking as an author, but it's also very exciting when you do know that something is not working, and you don't feel that energy, you don't feel that tingle of excitement deep in the gut that, oh, I've got to go back and this is the story. But it's rather oh gosh, you know, plodding through. And I got that back once I changed that. That was a really fundamental thing. That was a sort of a literary diagnostics thing. It's something that you and I talk about quite a bit. It's a really big picture fundamental thing. And you don't want to get to the end of a fifth draft and work out you've got the wrong character. But I think that's okay. That's what these early drafts are for, and trusting your instincts on that.
Yeah. Do you have a sort of number of drafts that you usually are going through? So you've done the big picture, the structural thing, and then is it a matter of going back and doing a chapter by chapter or scene by scene, you know, revision, and as you say, honing in on the more
that's
detail?
Right. Yeah. So I think the first draft is the vomit draft. The second draft is the getting everything in the right order, and those big picture things. And then the following drafts, I'll go back, I will print it out again, go back exactly the same, one read through as a reader, and then one read through with the red pen again. And on this one, I'm thinking, I'm sort of looking more at the characters here. Are the characters distinct enough? Are they, you know, are they interesting enough? Have I got too much backstory? Have I got not enough backstory here? And so this is much more of a character issue. And then you can start looking at, I often look scene by scene or chapter by chapter. And this is where I think, having written a lot of short stories as well, that's been a really useful, I know a lot of novelists, I know that you've written short stories too. It's a really useful discipline in, you know, cutting out of a lot of the extraneous stuff. And I try and remember this quote. It's in Strunk, isn't it? Elements of Style, something like, a sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph no unnecessary sentences, for the same reason that a drawing should contain no unnecessary lines and a machine no unnecessary parts. So it's basically cutting out a lot of that stuff. And each scene, and it's not too late to cut, this is where you're seeing things that you don't need, you know, things that slow the story down, big chunks of exposition or backstory which need to be moved out, which could be turned into dialogue. So you're starting to get down to a sort of a character base and a sort of style base at that stage. You're starting to, I feel like I'm smoothing out the lumps. I'm sort of adding bits where it looks a bit lean, cutting back where it sort of seems to be dragging a little bit. And so my third draft will be much more sort of a stylistic thing. And look, how many drafts does it take? It takes as long as I've got, I think, really. And I think if there's a deadline, that really does help to, to home. And I think somebody once said, like, a novel is never finished, it's merely abandoned or something. And I think I basically keep redrafting until the deadline, and sort of just homing in on the smaller and smaller detail. And that's being traditionally published with a contract. And I know that you've had the experience of being traditionally published and also with self-publishing plans. So I wondered if you'd noticed, those self-imposed deadlines, whether that changes your drafting process or not.
Yeah, well, I've always been great with the deadline, and it's really hard not to have an external deadline for me. I'm not someone who's a super organized person by nature. I'm not a big planner with my time, although I'm learning to do that more and more.
You look very much from the outside as though you are. You look very organized. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, that is a hard part of the self-publishing thing for me, is having that deadline and just always moving it. I'm like, oh well, yeah, I think, for instance, by the 14th of this month, I was supposed to have printed my draft of my current novel and read through and made some notes. Well, it's still on the computer, hasn't been printed, so pretty sure that's not going to happen in a week. So in my head, I'm like, oh well, no one's waiting on it, so I'll just push it back a little bit. So that is for me a hard part of doing it yourself.
Yeah.
Having nobody, ringing and saying, is it ready yet? When are you sending it to me? So yeah, I do miss that side of trad publishing for sure. I guess on the other hand, it does give you the luxury of being able to spend more time. Like, I know I spent a lot more time revising Essie's Way, turning it into All We Dream than I originally thought, but I'm really glad I took the time to do that, because I'm quite happy with the finished process, the finished product. But yeah, it is tough when you haven't got that outside. I mean, you do have things like, I did have it booked in with an editor to do a line edit on it. So you still do have some of those deadlines for sure if you're indie publishing. And they're great, once you can lock in some of those things, and once you get your cover back from your cover designer and things start to all get pulled together, that you need to ramp up the process a bit. Yeah.
I mean, it's hard because the more drafts you do, the better the book is going to be. And I think that the writers that are successful are the ones who are prepared to put in the time and keep redrafting and redrafting. A redraft doesn't have to be a complete rewrite. It can be, a small change in something, or a redraft, looking for specific things, or an edit. But I must admit that sometimes you can come across a little nugget of gold, even sort of quite later in the drafts. And I did that with the very first book, The Single Ladies of Jacaranda Retirement Village. And my main character, Peggy Smart, one of her main characteristics is her use of malapropisms, which is where she tends to get her words, delightfully mixed up. And that didn't come until quite a late draft. It was almost like, once I knew that character really well, she sort of let down her guard and this slipped out. And so there's always that feeling that, if I keep going a little bit long, something wonderful is actually going to materialize. But, often it doesn't. And, you have to work to a deadline. So, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, there's always the danger, I think, of over editing. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think, there's a number of, I think painters would, artists would know this phenomenon, that, it looks pretty perfect, but then you start to do a few bits and you can spoil it. You can overpaint a painting. You can over edit a book, because sometimes the best writing is that free, that sort of raw stuff that you produce in the first draft. Yes, it needs tidying up, but you can edit out that magic sometimes, I think. And that's what I think. The danger of letting too many people into that edit and getting too many opinions as well means that you can lose that sometimes. And you have to develop an instinct, I think, for what to keep that real core of the story there, the real essence of the story, and not lose sight of that. So yeah, look, editing is great, something that I have learned to embrace. I think it's a little bit confronting for first-time writers when suddenly you have what seems to be pages and pages of criticism and you know, sometimes helpful suggestions, but often just pointing out where things are not working. And but I think that, yes, I think you have to keep that balance between holding on to what you know and what your instinct says is right, and taking advice from other people.
Yeah, I always remember the story of Tim Winton. I think it was with Dirt Music, who he told the story of, I think he'd spent 7 years or something writing the book, and was, you know, had obviously pushed a few deadlines and was due to take it down the next day to his publisher. It was in those days it was printed out on paper, and he packaged it up, you know, and he was actually, I think, riding down to his publisher's office on a push bike or something. I could be telling this wrong, but I've got the details, the nuggets of it right. Yeah, probably. And he just knew that there was something not right about it, and it turned out it was the voice in the story, you know. Anyway, the next day he didn't take it down. I think he actually got up that night, opened it, put it aside, and started the whole thing from scratch, and wrote the whole complete novel in something like 56 days, I think. You know, like, he obviously had the whole story in his head and the characters and everything, and knew them intimately after 7 years. But yeah, that's an interesting way of tackling it. And Charlotte Wood too. I've heard her talk about having to just, or sometimes if you are just really stuck and feel like you're getting to the point where you're over revising and you're not making any progress, you know the story, put it aside and just start the whole thing again. Just to keep that voice flowing, you know. I mean, I've never done that particular, you know, process, but I can imagine that it could work if you had the time.
Because there is so much in your mind, particularly if you're going from, you know, this little bit in chapter 1, and then you're in chapter 13, and then you're in chapter 56. You know, it's like the whole thing is in your head, all the relationships between the characters and the setting and the timing and things. But you know, you can lose that whole sense of the whole story, I think, once you're down to the nitty gritty and you're down to the line level. Having said that, you know, I'm still sometimes making changes. I don't know about you, when you get the proofs, final proofs from the publisher, and I think my editors, I must drive them absolutely bonkers, because I'm often sort of sending emails saying, could we change this, or could we, I've noticed it. And in fact, on the Mrs. Henry Parker book as well, I noticed something very close to publication, which was where she'd set sail on a 4-week journey, and she'd left London in February and arrived in August, shivering into the satin lining of her winter coat. In fact, she'd arrived in March, and it was sweltering hot in Sydney. But, you know, you just something like this at the very last minute. So, yeah, look, there's a fine line between editing out the beauty and the magic of the story, to getting those last little bits right, and picking up those last few blunders.
And it's amazing how, you know, that example you gave, how many eyes had been on it. I mean, yours multiple times, but also your editor, your publisher, and nobody picks it up. It's amazing.
I'm sure somebody would have. I'm sure there would have been an email from somebody.
Yeah,
if there had been.
Definitely. So, Jo, when you're getting down to the nitty gritty, down to those, you know, really fine line edits, I think you've got a little bit of an example there to share with us about the sorts of things that you're changing.
Yeah, sure. So we'll probably put this up on the screen. So I've been very lucky this time with this manuscript. We'll call it the kiosk. That won't be the final title. With the kiosk, I had feedback from 3 beta readers, which was enormously helpful. And you know, that's the whole conversation about beta readers on its own. And so I did make quite a few changes to my opening chapter. That's the one that I will share. And really, in a nutshell, what the beta reader or one of the beta readers was saying about, this is the opening chapter, and it's two sisters driving in a very unroadworthy car called the Blue Bomb, and they're off to hospital for an appointment. So we're introducing two characters here. And, I like to start, this comes back to the short story thing. You like to start in the middle of the action, sort of arrive late and leave early, into that. So I'm arriving in a scene with quite a bit of action. But what the beta reader has said is that one of my major one of my habits, veering off into backstory too soon. So we're just getting the action, we're just opening it, and it's forward movement, and then we're in backstory. So we get a bit of a paragraph of what's gone on before, which backstory at the beginning, it will slow down the action. It will take the reader out of that. So it's about how I could sort of set up the situation, why these two women were in the car together, why there is obviously tension and conflict between the two. Why is it that neither of them is really happy to be there, without giving a big dump of backstory. And what the beta reader had suggested, which was very helpful actually, is that to move some of that backstory to later chapters, which is what I did, but to turn some of it into dialogue as well. So it's amazing what you can do with dialogue. If you have a big chunk of what seems to be, prose exposition, which is a bit sort of weighty and not really going anywhere, is to turn it into a bit of a backward forward dialogue. And that's really what I've done. And turned up the tension. And I was sort of explaining things in that first chapter that didn't need to be explained. Well, I think what I needed was more of a hint at what the situation was, why they were there, but not explaining it. So more of a show don't tell, and leaving little hints there which I could then explain and reveal through the story. So I'm happy to put up both versions of that where I've made those
we'll put them
changes
up on the website.
Yeah,
that'd be
so
really
they're just for an
people.
example. So a lot of the initial stuff, it won't have changed from the first draft. I'll have tidied up the sentences and changed the grammar, and but yes, it's about knowing where to start, because that first chapter, that's the hook. And I think that's my most important chapter. And that's probably the one I write, other than the ending, the most times until I'm happy with that. So in fact, this chapter wasn't even in the first draft, I think, but from the second draft onwards. So and what about you? Have you got an example as well?
Yeah, look, I
you're
thought
going to
it
share
might be
with us?
interesting to show you this, if I can attempt to screen share.
You're very clever at this.
Well, let's see how we go. Oh, there you are. It worked. Can you see that, Jo?
Oh, well done.
Yeah. So this is in Scrivener, and you can see on the side with the colour, I don't know if it's right or left for people looking at it, the side with the lines and things here. So this was the original version, but the coloured bits are the changes that have been made. So the things that have been deleted, crossed out, and the additions in blue. So the big thing that I was doing with Essie's Way, turning it into All We Dream, was really deepening the point of view. That was a really major thing for me. I do like to write now in quite deep point of view, which I'd done in Cross My Heart, my previous book. And I really wanted to, particularly with Miranda, the younger character, was to really go further into her character and into her perspective. So again, I can put examples of this up on the website. I'll put a blog post up which includes all this, but there's a couple of things here. Like if you see this sentence, this one here, so the original would have been, the previous meeting had taken place in the office, but Father Donnelly liked to see his couples in the church itself. Said, gave, help. So you can see all the words that I've crossed out there. I won't read through the whole thing, but that became Father Donnelly's assertion that meeting in the church itself would help them feel more comfortable with the church environment was not holding up. So I'm more in the character's head and telling the story from her thought perspective. And that's probably what I did the most of as I went through revising, particularly, as I said, Miranda's character. So this is what I love about Scrivener too, because it is quite interesting to go back and you can see what you've changed. You can take snapshots of your original version, which I intended to do with every scene, but as I did it for probably the first half, and then as I went through, I I forgot about that because I just got involved with the revision. But it was interesting, and has been interesting. I've used this a little bit in teaching, to just show about how tightening up the writing, because the original version, even though it was published, I did have a different writing style, a different voice. I wasn't writing particularly in deep point of view. So I really wanted to go through and take out all the, things like she thought, reflected, wondered,
Yeah.
remembered, said. I really tried to reduce the saids and make that more of an action, put an action beat with whatever the character was saying. So that sort of thing was really what I was working at. And as I said, it did take a lot longer than I anticipated to actually do all that.
But well worth it. But it's interesting how we tend to think we have our writing voice very early on, but even somebody like you who's experienced writer, that your voice is still sort of evolving, and that you can make those changes and make that much more true to your natural voice even at that stage.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, as you would know, Jo, each novel that you get, you improve your craft. We're always learning things about the writing process. It's not like you write your first novel and that's your style and it's set in stone forever. We're always evolving, our stories are evolving, and the way we tell them. So that's why it's been great for me to have that opportunity to, and I probably wouldn't do it with every book, but as I say, this particular one was a little bit of a tight deadline for me, and so it was great to have that opportunity to see just what I could do with it in terms of my style now. So it's been great.
Isn't it wonderful to think that writing is the one thing that you get better as you get older at doing? Yeah, but you can start at any age, and the older you get, the better you get at it, and the more you do, the better you get at it.
Yeah, it is. That's very true. Jo, you mentioned beta readers. Do you always use beta readers? When you get to that stage, you've had a couple of revisions and then you want some feedback on it before you send it to your editor and your publisher?
Yes, look, I have used beta readers with some novels and not others. Certainly my first novel, The Single Ladies, which was under a different title, I did have actually paid for a manuscript assessment of that. Actually, it was not very flattering at that stage, and I was really this close to throwing the whole thing out and thinking it,
Wow.
it wasn't working at all. And I then workshopped it with the likes of Kate Forsyth. I did her Story Doctor workshop, which was absolutely fantastic. And one of the things that I learned I learned a lot from Kate, but one of the useful things I took away and I've used since then is that she gave us an exercise where we have to give each chapter a name or a title, if you like, which is like a bit of a description, and then to explain what purpose that scene has, and it really has to have at least one or more than one, and that's something that I continue to do. In fact, I kept the chapter titles in that book, which were really quite quirky, and I really liked them, and luckily so did the publisher. So with subsequent novels, the next two novels, I didn't really. I think my agent was my beta reader, and then I went straight through to my publisher and the editors at Hachette, which was wonderful. There was quite a bit of work to do on both of those. And on this latest novel that I've recently submitted, I did get three beta readers, one of whom is in our writing group. One is a sort of a friend that I've met at various functions, and one is quite an established author. So it was fantastic to have those. Now, beta readers, I think getting the right one is the key to this. And if you give it to your best friend or your spouse or your grandmother or whatever, the chances are they're going to come back and say, this is wonderful. And even people who are other writers who you may be very close to, sometimes can give very good feedback, but I think sometimes there is a reticence about giving really frank feedback when things are not working. And I think you have to have a level of maturity as both a beta reader and a writer to accept that. So having somebody who is experienced but a little bit removed is probably a really good way of doing that. And, you know, I think you don't have to accept everything that a beta reader suggests or sees is wrong. They'll often say the same things, and you'll know that they're all saying, this for me didn't work, this section is dragging a little bit, yeah, this worked, this is great, this voice is okay, no, this ending didn't work. And they all agreed on certain things. And so I knew, and it was like you know where the bodies are hidden, really, don't you, as a writer? And you submit things and you think, actually, nobody's going to notice that little inconsistency there, or that I've, you know, rushed through that scene or skipped over that. And then, no, there it comes back. I think this needs more explanation. I think we need more backstory on this. So you know in your heart of hearts where these things are going to be, but sometimes it's a surprise. And I know that there are some writers who don't like suggestions of how to fix things. I love suggestions of how to fix things. And my beta readers came up with some fantastic ideas that I did try, and I deleted some scenes and I wrote some new ones, and something at the ending I completely changed. And I think it really, for me, this experience has been very positive, actually. So I will be thanking them in the acknowledgements for that. So so I've done both, some books with beta readers, some without. How about you? Do you have a sort of policy
I
with
totally
beta readers,
agree.
Pam?
Yeah, don't give it to your mum or your look. Some people say, "Oh, yeah, my mum's my first reader or your beta reader," and for some people that does seem to work. In general, I think having other writers look at it for you, because they've got that radar tuned on. You know, they know what they're looking for. They know to see where the gaps are and the plot holes and things like that. So I usually give it to, and we do have the luxury of having a reasonable number in our writing group. So it's great because if we want to give the whole manuscript or certain scenes, we can give them to a couple of people to start with. And then, because once you've read it once, it's probably not good to then use the same person for the next version or three versions down, because, you know, they're going to be coming to it with that prior knowledge. So yeah, it's nice to be able to spread around at different stages to use different beta readers. So yes, I do have people in our writing group, obviously, as beta readers. Penny and I have for the novel that I'm yet to complete. We did do a thing for a while where we swap scenes, once a week, and we'd give each other feedback. But I also have a good friend who's a reader. She doesn't write, but she's a voracious reader. She loves reading the style of books that I write. And it has been a little bit of I've had to sort of massage her into telling me, giving me really honest feedback, because she's just so lovely. She wants to tell me how wonderful it is. But of course, that's not what you want. It's nice to hear that, but you need
Well, you
to
want to
have
hear it, but it's not very helpful, really, is it? So you want, I suppose, ideally, you want really another writer, and maybe just one writer who, you're perhaps at the same level. It doesn't have to necessarily be the same genre. I think you can swap work and and be fairly honest about things, and not to take that to heart, because you feedback is there just to try and make things to improve things. It's not to sort of there's no novel that's perfect. I can't remember who said a novel is just a long piece of writing with something wrong with it, and there's always going to be something wrong, but it's helping you to someone who shares your vision, perhaps, but can help you look at things in a different way.
And have you got any particular sort of diagnostic tools, Jo, if you have got a scene that you just think it's just not working, but I don't know why? How would you approach that?
I don't think I've got anything hard and fast. I would like to be able to point you to one particular, craft book or one particular checklist. I think I've developed my own checklist, which I probably have in my head. So, and I think that's something that you gain with experience, of writing again and again and again. And I can't often say why it is, but I'll know something isn't working. And so I'll look at my usual thing, which would be, the preachy thing, the over-explaining some things and under-explaining others, too much backstory early on, and too much exposition, not enough dialogue, not too little dialogue. Overused words. Now, this is an interesting one, isn't it? I will sometimes do a search for those overused words. These are sort of getting towards the sharp end, the sort of high focus thing. But the amazing, if you're a good edit, I think, is you should be cutting words rather than adding them. And I think I searched for the word just, and I found something like 400 in my last manuscript at all. So no, I think I've developed more of a mental tick list there than something I actually anything systematic, I have to say. I don't know, you're probably far more logical about it than that. Or
no, not really.
are there any sort of books or anything that you think do this well?
No, but I am a big fan of the Margie Lawson highlighting technique. So sometimes, I mean, I have done it with whole manuscripts in the past, gone through and used a different coloured highlighter for, setting, dialogue tags, underlining all the action in red pen. And again, I'll put up, in that blog post that we're going to do an example of this, because I find that a really useful tool. So if you end up with a scene that's, 3/4 of it is green, which is description, and 3 lines of underlined action, then you know that you've probably got to switch things up, and maybe there's no dialogue in there, and depending on the kind of scene it is. But I find that really helpful if I'm really on a scene that I'm totally stuck on and I just can't think where to go with it. So that's a good tool, I think.
Yeah. So another tool that I've used, I've talked about this before, is something I learned from Valerie Parv, actually, was, if you're stuck up against something and it's not working, you're not quite sure how to get a character out of a situation, or whatever it is, whatever the situation is to write down 1 to 20 on a piece of paper and just write down 20 possible, I didn't know how a novel ended. I wrote down 20 possible endings. I mean, the most bizarre, the most outlandish things, and the more outlandish the better, really. And one of those will be the right answer, but sometimes just brainstorming that. And the other thing is sometimes just to turn it 180, just to do the exact opposite of what you've got there. So something is happening, something doesn't happen, they don't get there in time, the bomb goes off or something. So just to see what would happen if you completely turn it on its head and give it a twist. So that's sometimes how I write my way out of where it gets a bit bogged down or boring and it's not working, is just completely shake it up.
Yeah, the old make things worse.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I love that. And sometimes, like you say, with a particular character issue, if you think I'm just not getting to the bottom of this, I like to sometimes go back to a great craft book like this one, The Emotional Craft of Fiction by Donald Mass, which is my most recent favourite. And there's some great exercises in there where you can just sort of really hone in on a particular aspect of your character, if you know that that's not working. So sometimes going back, or even writing a letter to your character and asking them, what's going on here? What's the problem, or what am I not seeing? And then writing the response back from the character.
That's a great thing to do. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it is. Fantastic. It's gotten me out of a couple of little issues, that one. We're almost probably at the end, Jo, but I'm just double checking to see if there's anything that we've missed. Is there anything that you think we haven't covered? I mean, we could talk forever, obviously, about revision, but
while I was thinking about sort of preparing for this interview, I went back and watched a lot of the masterclass videos, the online masterclass, and listened to various writers, sort of quite well-known and successful writers, talk about their editing and rewriting process. So I think there was Dan Brown, Neil Gaiman, James Patterson, Margaret Atwood, David Baldacci. And it's actually interesting how similar their approaches were, the importance and the emphasis that they do put on rewriting and editing. And although they may have slightly different ways that they do it, the general feeling, I think, is that we're all doing the same sort of thing. But one of the things that Margaret Atwood was saying is that often it's getting over completion fear, because once you say this is complete and this is ended. There is no more tweaking, there is no more editing, because I think that's the hardest thing, is to know when you've done enough and to when to stop. And sometimes I think it's overcoming that fear and saying, no, enough, this is finished.
It's a little bit like letting a child go out there into the big wide world,
Yes.
isn't it?
That's right.
Hoping that you've done everything you can to make them,
Yes, yeah.
And are there any, that's great advice. I love that. And they're fabulous videos, aren't they? The masterclass ones.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and there's loads of stuff on YouTube too that people can access if, they don't have to necessarily pay for masterclass and things. Are there
That's
any
right.
craft books that you would recommend for revision, Jo, if people are looking for that?
I don't think there's one that I can recommend. I think that you're the craft book queen. I think there are the members of our writing group who do. So no, I can't think of one that I would recommend. I think that I've just sort of I've taken bits from everywhere. I've taken bits from interviews, from what I've read other writers, what I hear other writers do, and I'm holding it all up here. So maybe I'll have to write a sort of checklist one day.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, there's that one that I mentioned, which isn't particularly about revision, but it is great for the emotional side of, developing your character. And that's something too that I guess particularly in this revision with Essie that I really looked at that emotional side more, and how I was showing those emotions rather than sort of or just making sure that I was showing them. This is a really old one that I pulled off my shelf, the Manuscript Makeover by Elizabeth Lyon. And it's one that I find I just keep going back to every now and then. So it's a great one I'd recommend for people. I think you could probably still get it. I've had that for 20 years, but you can see it's well used. And the other one is this one by James Scott Bell, Revision and Self-Editing. It's got some of those great checklists and things to double check on. So that's one I'd recommend to people. So your next step, Jo, is to get the kiosk back and dive into the structural edits and things alongside
That's
your
right.
editor.
Yes, I think I'd taken that manuscript as far as I could, and I think when you can't see, it's still not quite right, but you can't see the wood for the trees anymore. So I'm actually really looking forward to getting that back and hearing my editor's thoughts on that, and so get stuck into the next lot of revisions. And luckily I've had a couple of weeks off to give my brain a little bit of a rest, and I'll come back to it hopefully with fresh eyes. Yes. And what about you? What are you up to?
Well, I am going to print off those pages and start that process of reading through. I'm only at 75,000 words in this one. So I know it needs probably another 30, 25 or 30. And then it'll be, back and forth with the adding and cutting. But I've made the mistake of writing it over a long period of time. So I'm sort of at the point now where I'm 3/4 way through. I know where it's going to end.
Yeah.
But there's things that I can't even remember have happened at the beginning. And in fact, I don't even know where the beginning is. So it's really a jumble of hodgepodge scenes at the moment. I haven't been very good at the whole plotting and planning thing with this one. So I'm just going to print it out, read it, see what I've got, and then add in what I need to, and then go through that whole process we've discussed.
I'm sure you'll be very pleasantly surprised.
Oh, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
When can we expect the kiosk out, Jo?
This will be out hopefully later in 2021, perhaps around October. I'm not quite sure of the publication date yet. Everything got a little bit bumped back last year, and so we'll have to see if the schedule's caught up. But late 2021 with a new title. It's likely to have St Saviour's Hospital. It's set in a hospital, in a volunteer-run sort of tea room kiosk.
Yeah.
In a hospital, so some of those words in some form will end up in the title.
Oh, we look forward to it. And of course, The Great Escape is from Woodlands Nursing Home is still out there. And if people haven't read it, where would you recommend they find it, and where can they find you online?
Well, I always send people to their local independent bookshop. I'm a huge believer in we should support our local bookshops, and if we don't, they will disappear. But for those who can't get to a bookshop, it'll be online at Dimmicks and Booktopia, and it's available in ebook at all platforms and in audiobook as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jo, for spending this time. It's been a really lovely chat, and all the best with the kiosk and the next part of the revision.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me on. I've enjoyed our chat.
Thanks, Jo.
Bye.